Welcome once again, my friends, and thank you for stopping by to listen to an old storyteller. Today we have an American tale, and the title of this story is The Celebrated Jumping Frog of Calaveras County. In compliance with the request of a friend of mine who wrote me from the East, I called on good-natured, garrulous old Simon Wheeler and inquired after my friend's friend, Leonidas W. Smiley, as requested to do, and I hereunto append the result. I have a lurking suspicion that Leonidas W. Smiley is a myth, and that my friend never knew such a personage, and that he only conjectured that if I asked old Wheeler about him, it would remind him of his infamous Jim Smiley, and he would go to work and bore me to death with some exasperating reminiscence of him as long and as tedious as it should be useless to me. If that was the design, it succeeded. I found Simon Wheeler dozing comfortably by the barroom stove of the dilapidated tavern in the decayed mining camp of Angels, and I noticed that he was fat and bald-headed, and had an expression of winning gentleness and simplicity upon his tranquil countenance. He roused up and gave me good day. I told him a friend had commissioned me to make some inquiries about a cherished companion of his boyhood named Leonidas W. Smiley. Reverend Leonidas W. Smiley, a young minister of the gospel, who he had heard was at one time a resident of Angel's Camp. I added that if Mr. Wheeler could tell me anything about this Reverend Leonidas W. Smiley, I would feel under many obligations to him. Simon Wheeler backed me into a corner and blockaded me there with his chair, and then sat down and reeled off the monotonous narrative which follows this paragraph. He never smiled, he never frowned, he never changed his voice from the gentle flowing key to which he tuned his initial sentence. He never betrayed the slightest suspicion of enthusiasm, but all through the interminable narrative there ran a vein of impressed earnestness and sincerity, which showed me plainly that, so far from his imagining that there was anything ridiculous or funny about his story, he regarded it as a really important matter, and admired its two heroes as men of transcendent genius in finesse. I let him go on in his own way, and never interrupted him once. Reverend Leonidas W. Reverend Le. Well, there was a fellow here once by the name of Jim Smiley in the winter of '49, or maybe it was the spring of '50. I don't recollect exactly. Somehow, though, what makes me think of it was one or the other is because remembering the big flume warn't finished when he first came to camp. But anyway, he was the curiousest man about, always betting on anything that turned up you ever see. If he could get anybody to bet on the other side, and if he couldn't, he'd change sides. Anyway, any way that suited the other man would suit him. Any way, just so's he's got a bet, he was satisfied. But still, he was lucky, uncommonly lucky. He most always came out the winner. He was always ready and laying for a chance. There couldn't be no solitary mention but that feller offered to bet on it, and take any side you please, as I was just telling you. If there was a horse race, you'd find him flush, or you'd find him busted at the end of it. If there was a dog fight, he'd bet on it. If there was a cat fight, he'd bet on it. If there was a chicken fight, he'd bet on it. Why, if there were two birds sitting on a fence, he would bet you which one would fly first. Or if there was a camp meeting, he would be there regular to bet on Parson Walker, which he judged to be the best exhorter about here. And he was, too, and a good man. If he ever see a straggle bug start to go anywheres, he would bet you how long it would take him to get to wherever he was going to. And if you took him up, he would follow that straddled bug to Mexico, but what he would find out where he was bound for and how long he was on the road. Lots of the boys here has seen that Smiley and can tell you about him. Why, it never made no difference to him. He'd bet on anything. Dangest feller. Parson Walker's wife laid very sick once for a good while, and it seemed as if they weren't going to save her. But one morning he came in, and Smiley up and asked him how she was, and he said she was considerably better. Thanked the Lord for his infinite mercy, and comin' on so smart that with the blessing of Providence she'd get well yet. And Smiley, before he thought, said, "Well, I'll risk 2.5 she don't anyway." This here Smiley had a mare. The boys called her the 15-minute nag, but that was only in fun, you know, because of course she was faster than that. He used to win money on that horse, for all she was so slow and always had the asthma, or the distemper, or the consumption, or something of that kind. They used to give her 200 or 300 yards start, then pass her under way. But always at the fag end of the race she'd get excited and desperate like, and come cavorting and straddling up, and scattering her legs around limber, sometimes in the air, sometimes out to the side amongst the fences, and kicking up more dust and raising more racket with her coughing and sneezing and blowing her nose, and always fetch up at the stand just about a neck ahead, as near as you could cipher it down. And he had a little small bull pup that to look at him you'd think he warn't worth a cent to set around and look ornery and lay for a chance to steal something. But as soon as money was upon him he was a different dog. His under jaw began to stick out like the forecastle of a steamboat, and his teeth would uncover and shine like the furnaces, and a dog might tackle him and bullyrag him and bite him and throw him over his shoulder 2 or 3 times. And Andrew Jackson, which was the name of the pup, Andrew Jackson would never let on but he was satisfied and hadn't expected nothing else. And the bets began being doubled and doubled on the other side all the time till the money was all up. Then all of a sudden he would grab that other dog just by the jint of his hind leg and freeze to it. Not chaw, you understand, but only just grip and hang on till they throw it up the sponge, if it was a year. Smiley always came out winner on that pup, till he harassed a dog once that didn't have no hind legs, because they'd been sawed off in a circular saw, and when the thing had gone along far enough, and the money was all up, and he come to make a snatch for his pet hold, he'd see in a moment how he'd been imposed on, and how the other dog had him in the door, so to speak, and he 'peared surprised. Then he looked sorter discouraged like, and didn't try no more to win the fight, and so he got shucked out bad. He gave Smiley a look, as much to say his heart was broke for putting up a dog that hadn't no hind legs for him to take hold of, which was his main dependence in a fight, and then he limped off a piece and lay down and died. He was a good pup, was that Andrew Jackson, and would have made a name for himself if he'd lived, for the stuff was in him, and he had genius. I know it, because he hadn't no opportunities to speak of, and it don't stand to reason that a dog could make such a fight as he could under them circumstances if he hadn't no talent. It always makes me feel sorry when I think of that last fight of his'n and the way it turned out. Well, this year Smiley had rat terriers and chicken cocks and tomcats and all them kinds of things till you couldn't rest, and you couldn't fetch nothing for him to bet on but he'd match you. He'd catched a frog one day, took him home, and said he'd collated to educate him. So he never done nothing for 3 months but set on his backyard and learn that frog to jump. And you bet you he did learn him, too. He'd give him a little punch behind, and the next minute you'd see that frog whirling in the air like a doughnut. Even seen him turn one somerset, or maybe a couple, if he got a good start, and come down flat-footed and all right, like a cat. He got himself up in the matter of catching flies, and kept him in practice so constant that he'd nail a fly every time as fur as he could see him. Smiley said all a frog wanted was education, and he could do most anything, and I believe him. Why, I have seen him set Daniel Webster down here on this floor. Daniel Webster was the name of the frog, and sit out, "Flies, Daniel, flies." And quicker'n you could wink, he'd spring straight up and snake a fly off'n the counter there, and flop down on the floor again as solid as a gob of mud might do. You never saw a frog so modest and straightforward as he was, for all he was so gifted. And when it came to fair and square jumping on a dead level, he could go over more ground at one straddle than any animal of his breed you ever see. Jumping on a dead level was his strong suit, you understand, and when it came to that, Smiley would ante up money on him as long as he had a red. Smiley was monstrous proud of his frog, as well he might be, for fellers had travelled and been everywheres. All said he laid over any frog that ever they see. Well, Smiley kept the beast in a little lattice box, and he used to fetch him down town sometimes and lay for a bet. One day a feller, a stranger in the camp he was, come across him with his box and said, "What might be that you got in the box?" And Smiley says, sort of indifferent like, "It might be a parrot, or it might be a canary. Oh, but it ain't. It's only a frog." And the feller took it and looked at it carefully, turned it round this way and that, and says, "So 'tis. Well, what's he good for?" "Well," Smiley says, easy and careless, "he's good enough for one thing. I should judge. He can outjump any frog in Calaveras County." The feller took the box again and took another long, particular look and gave it back to Smiley and said very deliberately, "Well," he said, "I don't see no p'ints about that frog that's any better'n any other frog." "Maybe you don't," Smiley said. "Maybe you understand frogs, and maybe you don't understand 'em. Maybe you've had experience, and maybe you ain't only a amateur, as it were. Anyways, I've got my opinion, and I'll risk $40 that he can outjump any frog in Calaveras County." And the feller studied a moment, and then says, kinder sad like, "Well, I'm only a stranger here, and I ain't got no frog. But if I had a frog, I'd bet you." Then Smiley says, "That's all right. That's all right. If you'll hold my box a minute, I'll go and get you a frog." And so the feller took the box, put up his $40 along with Smiley's, and sat down to wait. So he sat there a good while thinking and thinking to himself, and then he got the frog out and prized his mouth open and took a teaspoon and filled him full of quail shot, filled him pretty near up to his chin, and set him on the floor. Smiley he went to the swamp and slopped around in the mud for a long time, and finally he catched a frog and fetched him in and gave him to this feller and says, "Now, if you're ready, set him alongside of Daniel, with his forepaws just even with Daniel's, and I'll give the word." Then he says, "One, two, three, get!" And him and the feller touched up the frogs from behind, and the new frog hopped off lively. But Daniel gave a heave and histed up his shoulders, so, like a Frenchman, but it warn't no use. He couldn't budge. He was planted as solid as a church, and he couldn't no more stir than if he was anchored out. Smiley was a good deal surprised, and he was disgusted too, but he didn't have no idea what was the matter, of course. The feller took the money and started away, and when he was going out the door, he sorter jerked his thumb over his shoulder, so, at Daniel, and says again, very deliberately, "Well," he says, "I don't see no p'ints about that frog that's any better'n any other frog." Smiley, he stood scratching his head and looked down at Daniel a long time, and at last says, "I do wonder what in the nation that frog throwed off for. I wonder if there ain't something the matter with him. And he appears to look mighty baggy somehow." And he catched Daniel up by the nape of the neck and hefted him and says, "Why, blame my cats if he don't weigh 5 pounds," and turned him upside down, and he belched out a double handful of shot. And then he saw how it was, and he was the maddest man. He set that frog down and took out after that feller, but he never catched him. And here Simon Wheeler heard his name called from the front yard, and got up to see what was wanted. And turning to me, he moved away. He said, "Just set where you are, stranger. Rest easy. I ain't going to be gone a second." But, by your leave, I did not think that a continuation of the history of enterprising vagabond Jim Smiley would be likely to afford me much information concerning the Reverend Leonidas W. Smiley, and so I started away. At the door I met the sociable Wheeler returning, and he buttonholed me and recommenced. "Well, this here Smiley had a yaller, a one-eyed cow that didn't have no tail, only just a short stump like a banana, and, however, lacking both time and inclination, I did not wait to hear about the afflicted cow, but took my leave."
Thank you once again for listening to this story. If you enjoyed this story, please press that like button. Also, please help an old storyteller out by subscribing to my channel. The next story will be posted in a few days, so until then, may your story continue to be a good one.